I've spent the last 2 months going through everything I could find on how two allied nations, fighting the same war, in the same jungles, against the same enemy, handled the simplest human act of all, writing a letter home. The more I read, the stranger the picture became. On one side of a shared base, an American GI could sit down, pour his guts onto a page about everything he'd seen and felt, seal the envelope, and drop it in the mailbag. No one would ever open it. On the other side, an Australian digger writing to his mum in Melbourne knew that before his words reached her, an officer would read every line. The same war, the same mud, two completely different relationships between a soldier and his own private thoughts. And when I finally understood why, I realized this story reveals something far deeper about these two nations than anyone has ever properly explained. Nui Dat, Phuoc Tuy Province, South Vietnam. June 1967. Picture a young corporal from suburban Sydney, 20 years old, sitting on a sandbag outside his hoochie in the suffocating late afternoon humidity. The air is thick enough to chew. Somewhere in the rubber plantation surrounding the base, a Huey thumps its way toward Vung Tau. The corporal has a biro in one hand and a sheet of blue airmail paper smoothed flat on his knee. He's writing to his girlfriend. He wants to tell her about the contact his platoon made 3 days ago, about the way the jungle erupted with noise and how the soldier next to him screamed, about how his hands still shake when he picks up his rifle. He wants to tell her that he's scared, that this place is nothing like what the recruiters described, that sometimes at night the perimeter wire seems to breathe. But he knows something the American private in the next province doesn't have to think about. He knows that before this letter ever leaves Vietnam, an officer in his own battalion is going to sit down, open it, and read every word. So the corporal pauses. He scratches out a line. He rewrites, he softens, he lies, not to protect his girlfriend from the truth, but because the truth isn't his to share anymore. What I found when I started pulling at this thread shocked me, because this wasn't just about reading mail. This was about two entirely different philosophies of war, trust, and the relationship between a government and its soldiers. And the consequences would echo for decades. When people think about the Vietnam War, they think about American soldiers. They think about GIS on television, about Walter Cronkite, about letters published in hometown newspapers back in Iowa or Georgia. Vietnam has been called the first uncensored war in American history, and when it comes to the American experience, that reputation is largely earned. The U.S. military had conducted heavy censorship of soldiers' personal mail during both World Wars. Officers in units from Normandy to Guadalcanal were assigned the tedious job of reading through every letter, blacking out locations, unit strengths, anything that could aid the enemy. Loose lips sink ships wasn't just a poster slogan, it was enforced policy. As one military postal historian noted, it consumed enormous effort and manpower, with officers from chaplains to dentists pressed into service reading through stacks of personal correspondence. But after World War II ended, the U.S. military made a quiet decision that would have enormous consequences. They stopped censoring personal mail. The reasoning was practical. It consumed too much time and too many resources. And by the Korean War era, communications were moving faster than censors could keep up. By the time American combat troops began deploying to Vietnam in 1965, there was no systematic censorship of soldiers' personal letters home. An American infantryman could write about his exact location, his unit designation, the operations he'd been on, even draw maps showing where he was. And none of it would be intercepted or blacked out before it reached his family. Reading through the personal correspondence archives at institutions like the Center for American War Letters at Chapman University, the raw honesty is staggering. Soldiers wrote about firefights in graphic detail. They named their positions. They described fear, rage, disillusionment, and horror without any filter. One soldier wrote, "This is a dirty and cruel war," in a letter that was never screened, never censored, and eventually fell into enemy hands when he was killed in the Ashau Valley. The prevailing American assumption was straightforward. In a modern war with mass media coverage, trying to control what individual soldiers said in private letters was pointless. Television cameras were broadcasting the war into living rooms every night. Reporters roamed freely with combat units. The idea of having a lieutenant sit down and read Private Johnson's letter to his mother seemed like an absurd waste of time. Reading through these American accounts, I kept thinking, this makes perfect sense. Of course, you wouldn't censor mail in a war this transparent. But then I looked at what Australia was doing, in the same war, in the same country, at the same time. And the contrast stopped me cold. To understand why Australia censored its soldiers' mail in Vietnam while America didn't, you have to understand something fundamental about the two countries' relationships with military secrecy. Australia's tradition of military censorship runs deep, all the way back to the Boer War at the turn of the 20th century. The British Empire established elaborate postal censorship systems in South Africa, and Australia, as a dominion, inherited those practices wholesale. By World War I, the Australian Army Postal Corps was running letters through censorship offices in London before they could reach families back home. During World War II, the system was even more elaborate. Government censors scrutinized both military and civilian mail, blocking out sensitive information and, critically, anything that might damage morale on the home front. This wasn't just about protecting operational secrets. Australian censors were explicitly tasked with ensuring that families at home didn't learn too much about the grim realities of combat. The government's Department of Information instructed civilians to write cheerfully to soldiers, and censors made sure the information flowing in the other direction was similarly managed. When Australian military advisors first deployed to Vietnam in 1962 as the Australian Army Training Team Vietnam, a small group of 30 highly experienced jungle warfare specialists, the censorship apparatus traveled with them. These were elite soldiers, many with experience from the Malayan Emergency, led by Colonel Ted Sarong. They operated in small groups, often embedded with South Vietnamese forces or alongside American Special Forces in dangerous operations near the DMZ. The sensitivity of their missions made mail security seem logical. But here's where the story takes its critical turn. When Australia escalated its commitment in 1966, establishing the first Australian task force at Nui Dat in Phuoc Tuy province, eventually deploying nearly 8,000 troops at peak strength, the censorship infrastructure scaled up with it. This wasn't a handful of advisors on classified missions anymore. This was conventional infantry battalions, artillery batteries, armored personnel carriers, engineers, signalmen, and support troops. Ordinary soldiers, many of them national servicemen. Conscripts pulled from civilian life by a birthday ballot. And every single one of them had their mail read. Soldiers addressed their letters through the Australian Forces post office system, routing correspondence through AFPO numbers that would find the appropriate recipient. At Vung Tau, where the first Australian Logistics Support Group was based, postal corporals sorted through approximately 130 bags of first-class mail per month. But before those letters left Vietnam, they passed through the hands of censoring officers. The Australian government had additional reasons beyond operational security. Throughout the war, Canberra maintained extraordinarily tight control over all information flowing out of the Australian area of operations. The D-Notice system, a voluntary press censorship scheme introduced in 1952 under Prime Minister Menzies, operated throughout the entire Vietnam War. Australian troops at the front were forbidden from discussing military operations with reporters. Journalists were not allowed to enter combat zones where Australian troops were operating. In 1968, blanket censorship restrictions were imposed, requiring all correspondents to clear every story through an Army public relations officer before publication. The contrast with America's approach was almost absurd. While American reporters like David Halberstam and Neil Sheehan roamed freely with U.S. combat units, filming, interviewing, broadcasting, Australian journalists covering their own nation's war were kept at arm's length. And while American GIs wrote uncensored letters describing combat in unflinching detail, Australian soldiers knew their private words were being monitored. I spent weeks trying to understand the logic. And eventually, I found it, buried not in military doctrine, but in politics. The real reason Australia censored its soldiers' mail wasn't about protecting military secrets from the Viet Cong. It was about protecting the Australian government from its own citizens. In 1966, when the task force deployed to Nui Dat, the Menzies government, and its successor under Harold Holt, was selling the war to the Australian public through carefully controlled messaging. The government leveraged the public's ignorance about Vietnam to shape the narrative. Most Australians had never heard of Phuoc Tuy province. They didn't know what their soldiers were actually doing there, and the government intended to keep it that way. Consider the extraordinary security measures at Nui Dat itself. Unlike American bases, which typically employed local Vietnamese workers, the Australians cleared all inhabitants within a 4-kilometer radius of the base. No Vietnamese civilians were permitted inside the perimeter. This gave the Australians excellent operational security, but it also created a sealed information environment. What happened at Nui Dat stayed at Nui Dat, unless the government chose to release it. Now imagine what would have happened if uncensored letters had started arriving in Australian mailboxes. Imagine a national serviceman, a 20-year-old conscript who'd been working in a factory in Wollongong 6 months earlier, writing home to describe the Battle of Long Tan on August 18, 1966. Imagine him describing how D Company of 6 RAR, barely 108 men, was caught in a rubber plantation by a force that outnumbered them roughly 10-1. Imagine him writing about the rain, the noise, the bodies, the desperate ammunition resupply by helicopter as rounds were running out. The Australian government didn't want that letter arriving unfiltered at a kitchen table in suburban Australia. Not because the Viet Cong might read it, but because the voter might. Meanwhile, across the border in American areas of operation, that exact scenario was playing out every day. American soldiers wrote home about Ia Drang, about Hugh, about Khe Sanh, about My Lai, in raw, unvarnished detail. Their letters were published in local newspapers. They were read aloud at church services. They were shared with neighbors. And those letters, combined with unrestricted television coverage, fundamentally shaped American public opinion about the war. When I started mapping out the timeline, the pattern became undeniable. American public opposition to Vietnam grew rapidly as uncensored information from both soldiers' letters and media coverage flooded into households. By 1968, after the Tet Offensive, the American public had enough raw information to make their own judgment about the war. And they turned against it. In Australia, the timeline was different. Because the government controlled both media access and soldiers' personal correspondence, public knowledge about the reality of the war lagged significantly behind America's. The Australian government was able to maintain relatively higher levels of public support for longer, even as the same disastrous strategic situation was unfolding. But the most revealing moment I found came from the soldiers themselves and how they fought back. Australian troops developed ingenious methods to circumvent the censors. They used code words that their families would understand. Prearranged signals where mentioning a fictional relative or using a specific phrase communicated hidden messages. Others adopted a trick from their World War II predecessors, giving sealed letters to mates who were rotating home on leave, asking them to post the letters from civilian mailboxes in Australia once they landed. It was a simple and effective method of bypassing the system, and it was remarkably widespread. Some soldiers recorded audio messages on reel-to-reel tape recorders, a format that was harder for censors to systematically review than written letters. These tapes capture something the censored written letters never could. The sound of a soldier's voice cracking, the thump of helicopters overhead, the hesitation before describing something he wasn't supposed to talk about. But the most common response was something quieter and arguably more damaging: self-censorship. Many Australian soldiers simply stopped trying to communicate honestly. They wrote bland, cheerful letters, weather reports, and mess hall menus, because they knew anything real would be flagged or redacted. They sealed off the part of themselves that needed to speak honestly about what they were experiencing. And that silence followed many of them home. As the war dragged on, the divergence between the two systems produced dramatically different consequences for each nation. On the American side, the flood of uncensored information, letters, media, television, created what military historians now recognize as an unprecedented feedback loop between the battlefield and the home front. Soldiers wrote with brutal honesty. Private First Class Frank Kowalczyk, stationed at Long Bin Post in 1969, recorded audio letters to his mother in Illinois where he spoke candidly about the ARVN, about the reality of the combat zone, about his disillusionment. These unfiltered accounts accumulated into an overwhelming tide of ground truth that no amount of Pentagon press briefings could counter. The military postal system actively facilitated this openness. American servicemen could mail letters for free. Postage was waived for personal correspondence from combat zones. The Red Cross and USO set up recording stations across Vietnam and the Pacific for soldiers to create audio letters. The Voices from Home program, supported by the 3M Corporation, even provided recording equipment and mailing supplies. The entire infrastructure was designed to maximize communication between soldiers and families, with no filtering mechanism whatsoever. By the late 1960s, the consequences were visible. American families were receiving letters that directly contradicted official narratives. Soldiers described tactical failures, questioned the mission, expressed hatred for the war, and sometimes for the military itself. These letters didn't just inform, they radicalized. Families who had supported the war reversed their positions. Communities that had sent their sons off with parades began organizing against the draft. Australia's trajectory was markedly different. The government tightened information controls as opposition grew. In 1968, new blanket censorship restrictions were imposed on all correspondence covering Australian forces, requiring verbal guarantees that no conversation with any Australian soldier would be reported without clearance from an Army public relations officer. Few Australian journalists accepted these terms, which meant Australian military activities went largely unreported by their own nation's press. This created a bizarre situation. Australians were seeing the Vietnam War primarily through American eyes. Most of the television footage shown in Australia came from American media teams. Australian viewers watched American soldiers in American areas of operation, while their own troops' experiences remained largely invisible. The war that Australians saw on their televisions was not the war their own sons were fighting. The censorship of soldiers' mail was a critical part of this information blackout. As more troops rotated through, eventually nearly 60,000 Australians served in Vietnam over the course of the war. The volume of managed correspondence represented an enormous, sustained effort to control the narrative. Each letter that passed through a censoring officer's hands was another small act of information control, another brick in the wall between the Australian public and the reality of the war their government had committed them to. But the wall was crumbling. By the late 1960s, soldiers returning from their one-year tours were sharing their experiences directly with families and communities. The government couldn't censor face-to-face conversations. Veterans who had been unable to write honestly while deployed were now speaking honestly at kitchen tables, in pubs, at RSL clubs. The gap between what the censored letters had said and what the returned soldiers now described was itself a revelation and a source of deep anger. The anti-war movement in Australia gained momentum more slowly than in America. But when it arrived with force. The Vietnam moratorium marches of 1970 drew hundreds of thousands of Australians into the streets. The movement was fueled partly by what people had finally learned, and partly by their fury at how long the truth had been kept from them. By 1970, the full picture had crystallized, and the contrast between the two systems stood in stark relief. America's uncensored approach had produced, paradoxically, both the war's most powerful anti-war movement and its most valuable historical record. The letters American soldiers wrote home, raw, uncensored, heartbreaking, now constitute one of the most important documentary archives of any conflict in human history. The Center for American War Letters at Chapman University holds tens of thousands of original wartime letters spanning American military history, with Vietnam-era correspondence forming one of its richest collections. These letters have been published in books, dramatized in films, studied by historians. They survive as primary sources of incalculable value. Australia's censored approach achieved its short-term political objective. The government maintained higher levels of public support for longer than the Americans did. But the long-term cost was devastating. First, the historical record is impoverished. Australian Vietnam War letters, filtered through censorship, tend to contain what postal historians call mum and dad stuff: weather, food, mundane routines. The fear, the rage, the moral injury, the honest accounts of combat. Much of that was stripped out before the letters ever left Vietnam. Historians studying the Australian experience in Vietnam have far less personal testimony to draw from than their American counterparts. Second, and far more consequentially, the censorship contributed to a catastrophic failure in veteran care. Australian soldiers who had been unable to communicate honestly during their service came home to a society that didn't understand what they'd been through, partly because the government had systematically prevented that understanding from forming. The emotional distance, created by years of censored correspondence, didn't disappear when the soldiers stepped off the plane. Many veterans found they'd lost the ability to talk about their experiences at all. The aftermath was brutal. Some Vietnam veterans were excluded from joining the Returned Servicemen's League. Some were barred from marching in ANZAC Day parades by veterans of earlier wars who considered Vietnam an unworthy conflict. The isolation that had begun with a censoring officer opening a private letter in Vung Tau continued for decades, compounded by a society that simply didn't know, because it had been deliberately prevented from knowing, what its soldiers had endured. The 523 Australians who died in Vietnam left behind families who had received only sanitized accounts of their loved ones' final months. The nearly 2,400 who were wounded came home to communities that couldn't comprehend their injuries, physical or psychological, because the raw information that might have prepared those communities had been intercepted and controlled. When I assembled all of this, the true cost of those censored letters became undeniable. This wasn't just about operational security. It was about a government choosing to manage its own citizens' understanding of a war, using soldiers' private correspondence as one of its tools. And the soldiers paid the price. The legacy of this divide reaches well beyond Vietnam. America's experience with uncensored wartime communication fundamentally shaped how future conflicts would be managed. The Pentagon learned that uncontrolled information from the battlefield could turn public opinion. And in every major conflict since, from the Gulf War's embedded reporter system to the strict information management of Iraq and Afghanistan, the U.S. military has worked to recapture some control over the narrative without returning to outright mail censorship. Australia learned a different lesson. The recognition that information suppression, including the censorship of private letters, had contributed to veteran isolation and suffering, fed into the slow, painful process of reconciliation with Vietnam veterans that culminated in the Welcome Home March of 1987. The country began to acknowledge that controlling what soldiers could say had not protected them. It had abandoned them. What researching this story taught me is something uncomfortable but essential. The most dangerous censorship isn't the kind that hides military secrets from the enemy. It's the kind that hides the reality of war from the people whose sons are fighting it. An American mother in 1968, who read her son's uncensored letter from Khe Sanh, understood something about the war that an Australian mother reading a sanitized note from Nui Dat never could. That understanding, painful, raw, sometimes politically inconvenient, is what connects a nation to its soldiers. Without it, soldiers come home to strangers. I keep coming back to that young corporal at Nui Dat, biro in hand, scratching out a line because he knows an officer is going to read it. Somewhere in another province, an American private the same age is writing the same letter, except he's writing the truth. Both men are fighting the same war, but only one of them gets to tell his family about it. That difference mattered more than either government understood at the time, and for the men who lived through it, it matters still.